The stirrup leather creaks under the weight of a man who has been riding for 14 hours straight. It's August of the year 1096, and a French knight named Bohemond of Taranto is looking at the walls of Constantinople with an expression that mixes awe with something far more calculating. He didn't come here to fight Muslims. Not yet. He came here because he owed a debt, and because the stories about the wealth of the East had reached even the muddy fortresses of southern Italy. What he sees through the afternoon haze is a city that makes every castle he's ever stormed look like a child's sand fort. The Roman Emperor Alexios Komnenos watches Bohemond from a window in the Blachernai Palace, and he is not impressed. He is terrified. Alexios knows exactly who this Norman warlord is. He fought Bohemond's father years ago, and the scars still ache in damp weather. And now this same family has arrived at his gates with an army of perhaps 10,000 men, hungry, sunburned, and armed with the kind of crude ferocity that doesn't care much for imperial protocol. Alexios has a problem. He invited these warriors to come help him take back land from the Seljuk Turks. But now that they are here, standing inside his city, he realizes he may have just opened his front door to wolves. Here's what the textbooks leave out about the First Crusade. It was not a unified wave of religious fervor sweeping across Europe. It was a messy, violent, and deeply political chain of decisions made by men who saw opportunity in chaos. Pope Urban II gave a speech at Clermont in November of 1095, and yes, he called for Christians to march east and reclaim Jerusalem. But the crowds who heard him were not simple peasants burning with faith. They were knights looking for land, merchants looking for markets, second-born sons with nothing to inherit, and criminals hoping to wash away their sins with blood. The cross they sewed onto their cloaks meant different things to different people. The march itself was a catastrophe long before any battle began. The first wave of Crusaders, the so-called People's Crusade, led by a charismatic monk named Peter the Hermit, did not even make it to Asia Minor before they disintegrated. Peter's army was a mob of poor farmers, women, children, and elderly priests who believed God would part the seas for them. They looted villages in Hungary because they were starving. They fought Byzantine guards because they didn't speak Greek. And when they finally crossed into Turkish territory, the Seljuk cavalry met them at the Battle of Siveto in October of 1096. The chronicler Albert of Aachen records that the bodies piled so thick along the riverbank that the water ran red for 3 full days. Peter the Hermit survived because he had sailed back to Constantinople just before the massacre. His followers did not. The second wave was different. These were professional soldiers, counts, dukes, and lords, who understood logistics. They traveled in 4 distinct armies, each following a different route, and each led by a man who wanted to be remembered. Godfrey of Bouillon came from Lorraine with his brother Baldwin. Raymond of Saint-Gilles marched from Toulouse with a relic of the Holy Lance that he believed would protect them. Bohemond brought his Normans from Italy. And then there was the smallest but most dangerous army, the one led by a man whose name would become legend, though not for the reasons you might think. That is the difference between blind faith and brutal logistics. And if you have ever wondered which one actually wins wars, you already know the answer. Subscribe to keep following the real story behind the history they never taught you. And tell me in the comments, out of these 4 commanders, Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, or the Mystery Man, which one do you think makes it to Jerusalem alive? The journey from Constantinople to Antioch is roughly 600 miles of what modern geographers call the Anatolian Plateau. In the 11th century, it was a graveyard. The Crusaders had no supply lines, no maps worth trusting, and no understanding of the climate. They marched in summer, wearing chainmail that turned into an oven under the Anatolian sun. Their horses died of thirst. Their water skins dried up. The Seljuk Turks did not fight them in open battle. Instead, they used the classic steppe tactic: harassment, hit the edges of the column, kill the stragglers, poison the wells, and vanish before the knights could form a shield wall. The chronicles say the Crusaders were so desperate for water that they drank their own horse's blood mixed with salt. But here is the part that never makes it into the romantic paintings. The Crusaders also pillaged their own allies. When they reached a Christian Armenian town, they often sacked it anyway, because they needed food, and the local Christians were not quite the right kind of Christian. The Byzantine guides who accompanied them were treated with constant suspicion. Bohemond and Alexius argued bitterly over who would control any captured cities. The Crusaders had sworn an oath to return conquered land to the Byzantine Empire, but oaths written in ink tend to dissolve when steel is involved. Now watch what happens when they finally reach a real target. The city of Antioch was one of the great fortresses of the medieval world. Its walls stretched for miles, studded with 400 towers and protected by the Orontes River on one side and steep mountains on the other. The Crusaders arrived in October of 1097 and realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they had no idea how to take it. They did not have siege towers tall enough. They did not have enough men to surround the entire perimeter. And the emir who governed Antioch, Yagi-Sian, was no fool. He had stockpiled food, reinforced the gates, and sent messengers to the Seljuk Sultan asking for reinforcements. The Siege of Antioch lasted 8 months, and it was during those 8 months that the Crusaders discovered something about themselves that would define the entire crusading movement. They were not invincible. They were starving. They were dying of disease. And they were beginning to wonder if God had abandoned them. The winter of 1097 was brutal. Food ran out so completely that a loaf of bread cost more than a suit of armor. The Crusaders ate their horses, then their dogs, then the leather from their own saddles. They boiled the bark off trees. Some of them, the chronicles whisper, turned to cannibalism. Not as a desperate act at the very end, but as a grim calculation when the alternative was watching their children die. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilé writes that in the famine, the poor were forced to eat the flesh of the dead. He does not explain further. He does not need to. You think you know the Crusaders as heroes in shining armor, but the men who starved outside Antioch in February of 1098 were covered in lice, mud, and the dried blood of their own wounds. Their armor was rusted, their swords were chipped, and their faith was cracking like dry earth under the Seljuk sun. Then, in April, a wave of dysentery swept through the camp. It did not distinguish between ranks. Counts died in their tents next to common foot soldiers. Bishops blessed the dead while holding their own stomachs. The ground was too hard to dig proper graves, so they burned the bodies in massive pyres that filled the sky with greasy black smoke. The smell, thick, sweet, and horrifying, clung to everything, to their cloaks, to their hair, to the bread they no longer had. The Crusaders had two choices: surrender or find a way in. And the way in came from the most unlikely source imaginable. A man named Firuz, an Armenian guard who controlled one of the towers on the Antioch walls, had a grievance. He had been punished by Yagi-Sian for hoarding grain. He was also, according to some accounts, a former Christian who had converted to Islam under duress. Bohemond, always the strategist, found Firuz through a network of spies and intermediaries. He offered him money, he offered him safety, and he offered him something that every man in a besieged city craves: a way out. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond led a small party of crusaders to the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz lowered ropes from the battlements. The crusaders climbed up one by one, their chainmail muffled with cloth, their boots wrapped in rags. They captured the tower silently, then opened the city gates from the inside. The Crusader army poured into Antioch like a flood through a broken dam. That night, while the rest of the army slept in filth and starvation, a handful of men climbed ropes in the dark and changed the entire course of a war. If you've ever wondered what it really takes to turn a hopeless siege into a city falling, and trust me, the worst is still coming, then you need to be here for every single one of these stories. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the gates finally open and the frenzy begins. And drop Firuz in the comments, because history almost never gives the name of the man who betrayed the city. But without him, this invasion dies in the mud. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Crusaders, mad with hunger and rage, killed everyone they found in the streets. Muslims, Jews, and even the local Christians were cut down without distinction. The streets of Antioch ran ankle-deep in blood, a detail so consistent across multiple chronicles that it must be taken seriously as a measure of the violence. Yagisian fled through a postern gate, but was captured by Armenian villagers who beheaded him and brought his head to Bohemond as a trophy. The Crusaders had taken Antioch, but their nightmare was only beginning. 3 days after the city fell, a massive Seljuk relief army arrived under the command of Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Kerboga had 30,000 men. The Crusaders, exhausted, starving, and now trapped inside the city they had just conquered, had perhaps 15,000, and many of them were wounded. The gates of Antioch swung shut, and the hunters became the hunted. Inside the walls, the Crusaders were running out of hope. They had taken the city, but they had not found the food they desperately needed. The stocks that Yagisian had stored were nearly empty, and now they were besieged inside a fortress that they did not fully control. Desperate men began to desert. They lowered themselves from the walls on ropes and tried to slip through the Seljuk lines. Most were caught and killed. Some made it to the coast, where they boarded ships and sailed home to tell their families that the crusade was over. But then, something happened that changed everything. A poor priest from Provence, named Peter Bartholomew, came forward with a vision. He claimed that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a dream and told him that the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. If the Crusaders could find it, the saint promised they would be victorious. The leaders were skeptical, but their men were desperate, and desperate men believe desperate things. They dug into the cathedral floor at the spot Peter Bartholomew described, and there, buried deep in the dirt, they found the tip of an iron spear. This is where the line between faith and manipulation blurs forever. Was it a genuine miracle? Was it a relic planted by the same Peter Bartholomew to boost morale? Was it a piece of ordinary metal that men chose to believe in because the alternative, giving up and dying, was worse? The chroniclers argue about it to this day. What is not argued is what happened next. The Crusaders, carrying the Holy Lance before them, marched out of Antioch on June 28th to face Kerboga's army in open battle. The Seljuks saw them coming and laughed. They outnumbered the Crusaders at least 2-1. They had cavalry, they had archers, they had fresh horses and full bellies. But the Crusaders had something else. They had a story, and a story, when enough people believe it, becomes a weapon. The battle was a disaster for the Seljuks. Kerboga's army, which had been fractious and divided throughout the siege, disintegrated under the shock of the Crusader charge. The knights, fighting with the fury of men who had already died and been resurrected, smashed through the Turkish lines. The Seljuks fled, leaving behind their tents, their treasure, and their dead. Antioch was saved. The Crusaders spent the next 6 months resting and arguing. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself, breaking his oath to the Byzantine emperor. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, furious, refused to recognize Bohemond's rule. The army fractured into factions. For a while, it seemed the crusade would die inside the walls of Antioch, killed not by the enemy, but by the pride of its own leaders. But the common soldiers still wanted Jerusalem. They had marched 2,000 miles. They had starved and frozen and bled. They had seen their friends eaten by wolves and their commanders turn on each other. They were not going to stop now, so they forced the leaders to march south toward the ultimate prize. The road from Antioch to Jerusalem is roughly 300 miles along the Mediterranean coast. It took the Crusaders nearly 6 months. They stopped to capture smaller cities along the way, Acre, Tripoli, Beirut, but their hearts were elsewhere. They could almost feel the holy city waiting for them. And on the morning of June 7th, 1099, after nearly 3 years of marching, they finally saw it. The walls of Jerusalem rose against the pale sky, like the bones of the earth itself. The city was smaller than Constantinople, but its defenses were formidable. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared. He had poisoned the wells outside the city. He had reinforced the gates. He had summoned archers from Egypt and piled stones on the battlements. He intended to hold out until a relief army could arrive from Cairo. The Crusaders did not have a fleet. They did not have siege towers. They did not have enough timber to build them because the region around Jerusalem was almost entirely deforested, and they were running out of time. The summer heat was beginning. Their water was gone. Their food was nearly gone. And the sight of the city, so close and yet so unreachable, drove some of them to a kind of holy madness. They tried to storm the walls on June 13th. It failed catastrophically. The ladders they had built were too short. The Fatimid archers rained arrows down on them from every tower. The knights who reached the top of the walls were pushed off and fell to their deaths on the rocks below. The Crusaders fell back to their camp, exhausted and humiliated. And now, the real work began. The Crusaders needed wood to build siege engines, genuine towers and battering rams that could match the height of Jerusalem's walls. They needed ropes, nails, pitch, and leather. They needed craftsmen who knew how to build trebuchets, and they needed a miracle. They found the wood, eventually. Ships from the Italian city-states, Genoa and Pisa, arrived at the port of Jaffa, carrying timber and tools. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and hauled the wood overland, a grueling journey through hostile territory. They worked day and night, building 2 massive siege towers that they called castles on wheels. They covered them with wet animal hides to protect against Greek fire. And on the night of July 14th, they rolled them toward the walls. The Fatimids fought back with everything they had. They poured boiling oil from the battlements. They launched pots of burning naphtha that stuck to the hides and smoldered. They threw stones and javelins and arrows. The Crusaders, sheltered inside the towers, kept pushing. And as those towers crept forward through the darkness, every inch bought with blood and fire, the Crusaders knew this was their last shot. One more failure, and the whole campaign would dissolve into the dust of the desert. If you want to see whether that gamble paid off, whether Jerusalem fell or the Franks broke, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when the wall finally gives way. And in the comments, type "the long climb" if you've ever pushed through something that looked impossible, just to see what was waiting on the other side. At dawn on July 15th, the left tower finally reached the wall near the Herod Gate. The bridge dropped with a crash, and the first Crusaders poured onto the battlements. A knight named Leuthold of Tournai was the first man to set foot on the wall of Jerusalem. Behind him came Godfrey of Bouillon, his sword white with the dawn light. The door was open. What came through it, in the next 24 hours, would stain the name of the First Crusade forever. The slaughter inside Jerusalem was methodical and absolute. The Crusaders did not take prisoners. They did not accept ransoms. They killed everyone they could find. Muslim, Jew, and even the Eastern Christians who had lived in the city for centuries. They ran through the streets, cutting down men, women, and children. They chased survivors into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and killed them there. They burned the synagogues with the Jews still inside. The chronicler, Raymond of Aguilers, a man who was there, writes that the Crusaders waded through blood up to their knees. Another chronicle claims the blood reached the bridles of their horses. Historians debate the exact numbers. The medieval chroniclers, who loved hyperbole, claimed the Crusaders killed 70,000 people. Modern estimates put the figure closer to 10 to 15,000. But the horror is not in the number. It is in the certainty. Every single one of those deaths was intentional. Every one of them was celebrated as God's will. The Crusaders did not see themselves as butchers. They saw themselves as instruments of divine justice. They had marched 3,000 miles. They had lost their friends, their health, and their innocence. And now they had reached the end of their journey. They knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their hands still wet with blood, and they wept and prayed, and thanked God for delivering the city into their hands. That is the image that should haunt you, not the swords and the screams, but the prayers. The men who did these things believed they were doing the right thing. They believed God had commanded it. They believed that every drop of blood they spilled was a step closer to salvation. The First Crusade succeeded because it was brutal, because it was desperate, and because it was driven by a story that gave ordinary men the courage to do terrible things. It was not holy. It was not righteous. It was a long walk through starvation and disease and murder, at the end of which a handful of survivors did something that still echoes in the politics of the modern world. The Crusaders set up 4 Crusader states: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They governed with a mix of feudal law and military necessity. They intermarried with local Armenian and Syrian nobles. They built castles that still stand today: Crac de Chevalier, Kerak, Margat. And they waited for the counterstroke that they knew, somewhere in their exhausted hearts, would eventually come. The Muslim world had been divided and weak during the First Crusade. The Seljuk Empire was fragmenting. The Fatimid Caliphate was collapsing. But a new generation of leaders was rising in the East. Men who had watched their cities burn and their families die. Men who were learning the same lesson the Crusaders had learned: that a story, when enough people believe it, becomes a weapon. The seeds of the Second Crusade were already being planted before the blood on the Temple Mount had dried. And the men who would one day plant a flag on the walls of Jerusalem, the ones who would give the Crusaders a taste of their own medicine, were still children, watching the smoke rise from the horizon and wondering what kind of God would allow such a thing. The fortress stood, but the walls were cracked, and the world was watching.